Hey, how's everyone doing? So we're in this series called Us Versus Us, and I'm gonna start off by telling you a story. Now, when I was a kid, I had a childhood best friend like many of you probably had. His name was Stuart. We met when we were about 6 years old on a family trip to the aquarium. The thing about Stuart and I was we had a very unique friendship. For most people looking outside at our relationship, they would have said, you guys should never be friends. In fact, a lot of people where I came from would have said, you guys shouldn't have been friends, you should be enemies. Which sounds weird to say that you and your childhood friend should have been enemies, but there's a whole story as to why this is. And it didn't start in 1992 at the planetarium. It started in the 1500s. Because in the 1500s, King Henry VIII, who was mostly known for murdering his wives, crowned himself King of Ireland, who up to this point in their history had mostly been busy drinking Guinness and knitting iron sweaters. And they were not happy with this situation. They didn't like the idea that King Henry VIII would declare himself King of Ireland. So for 200 years, the Irish people, in a tradition that, contrary to popular opinion, was not started with Conor McGregor, fought off the big, giant, powerful opponent as hard as they could. And they did this for years and years. Eventually, a little while later, the British Crown came up with an idea, something that they would do in order to exert their influence in Ireland, to solidify their influence. And they decided that they would start to colonize Ireland in a program that came to be known as the Plantation. Now, in the Plantation, what you had was the British Crown came to Ireland. This is Ireland, by the way. I can't draw. I did not draw this. Kristen, our wonderful volunteer, head of guest services, she drew it. Round of applause for Kristen and her wonderful art. Thank you. So what they did was the British Crown had this idea during the Plantation that they would take land away from the Irish native landowners, right, who were mostly Catholic. They would take it from their hands and give it to the people who were coming from England, Scotland, and Wales, who were mostly Protestant. So the English took the land from the Irish and they gave it to those who were to people that they sent from England, Scotland, and Wales. And of course, the Irish people didn't like this either. And the program was supposed to take over the entire country of Ireland, but it didn't work all that too well, and it was only really successful in this one corner, the northeast corner of Ireland. And again, the Irish people continued to rebel. They don't like when anybody tells them what to do. And so they just kept fighting. And eventually, in the early 1920s, Ireland gained independence from Britain. But it was independence with a condition. And the condition was partition. Because the descendants of the people who had come during the plantation, the settlers, the Protestant people in Northern Ireland, feared that if all of a sudden the rule of Ireland was given back to the Catholic majority and that they were a minority within the country, that they might be discriminated against. And so they requested that when Ireland gained independence, that they would remain part of Britain while the rest of Ireland gained independence. And that is what happened. So Ireland was split in two in the 1920s into what is creatively called up here, Northern Ireland. The conference about that naming was long and extensive. And down here, they had the Republic of Ireland. Now, very soon after Ireland gained independence and Northern Ireland became its own country, which was united with Britain, two rival political factions rose up in Northern Ireland. The two sides were, on one side, Republicans who are not anything like your Republicans. Republicans who they wanted Northern Ireland to become part of a united Ireland and join up with the Republic of Ireland, thereby known as Republicans. And the other side of the conflict was the Unionists. Unionists who felt that Northern Ireland should remain unified with Britain. These were mostly Protestant people who wanted to maintain the union between Northern Ireland and keep it separate and part of Britain. And that led to 30 plus years of bloody sectarian violence. Over 3,600 people were slaughtered in brutal bombings and assassinations. until eventually, in 1998, on Good Friday of all days, the Unionists and the Republican side sat down and they came to a peace agreement. And they didn't solve the tension, and they didn't solve the division or the bitterness, but they stopped the violence once for all, which was an incredible moment in Irish history. Now, there are people probably watching on Facebook Live as we're broadcasting right now, and if you're from Ireland, you're probably thinking, that is way oversimplified, and it definitely is. But for most of you, you're thinking, wow, that's really complicated. And it is. It's really complicated. There's so much more to the story than that. But here's the thing. In 1992, at the aquarium when I met Stuart, we didn't know any of this. We were just two kids who got to know each other. And at the aquarium that day, Stuart was wearing this white t-shirt and white tennis shoes, and under the black light in the planetarium, it was glowing bright blue, and I thought, he's the coolest kid I've ever met. And so we became friends. And so over the next 15 years, Stuart and I were inseparable. We did everything together. We went everywhere together. We attended the same church. Our families attended the same church. And so we went through Sunday school together. We went to the same Christian youth group together. We just did everything together. But the one thing that bonded us more than anything was soccer. We were soccer lunatics. We watched soccer together. We played soccer together. We supported two rival soccer teams, so that led to some great debates. And we just always were just playing soccer or talking about soccer or doing something. And we just were inseparable. We loved each other. We shared stories with each other. All of our firsts we told each other about. The first time we started dating somebody, the first time we kissed a girl, and all of this stuff, we told each other all about it. He knew all the stupid mistakes that I made. He knew all the dumb things that I did, and I knew the same about him because we were best friends. Here's the thing about Stuart and I, though. I grew up in a little town called Dundalk, which is located right here, in the armpit of Ireland, if you will, right south of the border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. And Dundalk was a real Republican stronghold. Here, I grew up hearing stories of the British people, of the Unionists who stole our country from us and who wanted to oppress us. And I heard all of this narrative about how bad and how mean and how terrible they were. Stuart didn't grow up in the same town as me, though. Stuart grew up in a little town right about here, about 45 minutes away, called Portadown. And Portadown was a Unionist stronghold. People who lived there were Unionists. They had been for hundreds of years. His family was Unionist, his community was Unionist, he went to a school that was Unionist. He was around Unionist people, and he heard stories about those bad Republican people who wanted to take our land away from us, who hated us because we're Protestant and they're Catholic, who want to take things from us and they're bitter against us and they want to harm us and they want to hurt us. And those were the narratives that we grew up with. But Stuart and I were buddies. We were friends. We did everything together. We went everywhere together. And we talked about everything. Well, almost everything. We didn't really talk about politics. That was the one thing we kind of avoided. And any time that we maybe kind of creeped into the conversation, things would get really heated. And we'd start arguing. And our voices would raise. And it would turn into a shouting match. And sometimes we narrowly avoided a fist fight. But we stayed friends. And right up through college, we went to the same college together, and we were friends. Best friends. I was at his wedding. I sang a song at his wedding. And we stayed with each other through all of that. Because I would have said, I love Stuart. I told him a million times, man, I love you. And he would have said the exact same thing about me. But people looked at our relationship, people looked at our friendships and was like, that is weird. How are you guys able to be friends? You come from completely opposing political backgrounds. I would have said, and I'm ashamed of this now, but I would have said when I was a teenager, I hate Unionists. I hate people like that. I hate people who think that way. I hate people who believe the way that they believe. But the thing was, that was Stuart. He was part of that. And he probably would have said some of the same things about my kind. Here's what I realized. As I got into my 20s, Stuart, He ended up getting married right out of college pretty early. He moved off to England and started a family, and our lives just drifted apart. And to be honest, we haven't even spoken in about, it must be close to 10 years. But I remember getting into my mid-20s and looking back on our friendship and remembering him as my best friend and wondering, as my political views started to soften and change and become less polarized, I started to gain some perspective. I looked back and said, how were we able to be friends? How were we friends in the most unlikely of circumstances? How was it that I could hate Stuart's kind, but I couldn't even kind of hate Stuart? How was it that I could hate his kind, but I couldn't even kind of hate him? I think it's because the truth is people are easy to hate from a distance. But as I've learned from Brene Brown, people are hard to hate up close. When there's a face, when there's a name, when there's a story, when there's a relationship, we see people different. And in my mind, I grew up with a category, unionists. He grew up with a category, Republicans, people from the South, right? They want to take our stuff from us. And there was a category of people. But to me, Stuart wasn't a category. He was a person. And that made all the difference. Instead of just being a category of people, he was a human. He was an individual. He was a person. I think for all of us, we have a tendency to look at people who are different than us, who view the world different than us, who come from different places, who have different opinions, political or religious. And we say, it's us versus them. It's us versus Democrats. It's us versus the Republicans. It's us versus these people. It's us versus the white supremacists. It's us versus the Black Lives Matter. It's us versus the Trump administration. It's us versus Hillary supporters. But maybe we're missing the point. As we make it about them, about somebody outside of us, maybe we're missing the fact that really when it comes down to us, it's us versus us. It's us versus people. It's us versus our neighbors, our friends, people in our community. It's we versus ourselves. And if we could only get past the categories that we create and see the people, it might change everything. So I have a question. And I want us to just spend a few minutes with those around you talking about this. I've got two questions. The first is, have you ever been categorized? Have you ever felt like somebody has put you in a category of any kind, whether it's to do with politics or religion, opinion and orientation, your background, anything? Have you ever felt like you've been categorized? And then what categories do you tend to put people in? We're all guilty of this, as much and all as we might try not to. We don't always get this right. I didn't always get this right, and I still don't always get this right. But what categories do you tend to put people in? I'm gonna give you a few minutes to talk about this, and that might be like, oh my gosh, I did not come here to talk to other people. I get that. So here's the thing. In a few minutes, I'm gonna come back up, and I'm gonna talk about how we can have conversations about politics in a healthy way, in a way that's actually helpful rather than harmful. And if you're going, I know somebody who needs to hear that, like, oh my gosh, I wish they were here to hear how to do that, then just pull out your phone, send them a text and say, hey, go on Facebook. This is being broadcast on Facebook Live. Look up NP Nights and you can watch the rest. And if that's what you need to do to distract yourself, that's totally fine. Everyone else, I would love for you to take the next few minutes to talk about these questions, and I'll be right back up to finish part 2. All right, so I'm sure some of you had tense conversations there. It sounds like you're having great conversations, so that's awesome. I'm not gonna debrief the room because that could get heated. So let's just say, I hope you had great conversation. So for the next few minutes, I wanna talk not about what I think about politics or what we as an organization think about politics, or not what you should think about politics. I wanna have a conversation about politics in how to have a conversation about politics in a healthy way, because this can be so damaging. And the thing is, politics is often that taboo topic amongst most people, isn't it? I mean, this is the thing that we're told you're not supposed to talk casually about over dinner, right? You're not supposed to talk about politics. You're not supposed to talk about religion. And it's not because it's not important, right? This is not the reason why we avoid these conversations, not because it's not important, because it is important. It's very important. In fact, politics is how we organize ourselves for our mutual thriving. It's how we organize ourselves for our mutual thriving. If we are going to thrive together as a community, somebody's got to organize it. Somebody has to make some decisions, and we've got to make collectively some decisions about how are we going to get the water to people? Who's going to pay for it? How are we going to organize the city? What are the laws going to be to keep people safe? How do we have a police force? And how are we going to have a fire department? All of these things, they're extremely important because they're how we conduct our lives, and our aim is to mutually thrive together, but we've got to organize that. And so we don't avoid politics because it's not important. We also don't generally avoid politics because we don't have an opinion on it, because most of us do. Most of us have some opinion on politics. The reason we avoid it is because sometimes it matters so much, or our opinions are so strong that we're worried about what we might say. We're worried about what someone else might say, or how it might damage our relationship, because at the end of the day, the problem with politics is not politics itself, it's what it does to some of our relationships. It damages them, it breaks them. I bet everyone in here, or at least almost everyone in here, over the last 12 months has had to unfollow somebody on Facebook or Twitter. Am I right? Like there was somebody who you were like kind of friends with, and then they posted that thing and you were like, unfollow, unsubscribe, no thank you, right? And when we talk about this in person, some of us, we've lost friends over this. Some of us, we've got into heated arguments and we had to go and apologize about it. It's not because it's not important. It's not because we don't have an opinion. It's because it matters so much often, or because our opinions are so strong, so we politely avoid it. But that often leads to ignorance. And that's not where we want to end up either. We don't want to end up ignorant people who just don't talk about this, and then we don't know anybody else's perspectives. See, if we don't talk about how we're going to organize ourselves for our mutual thriving, there's a danger that we might be headed towards our mutual destruction. So we've got to talk about it. But is there a way to talk about politics well? Is there a way to talk about politics without the arguing or the insulting, in a way that maybe even brings us closer together rather than hurting our relationships, in a way that doesn't lead to ignorance, but where we might actually learn something? Is there a way to talk about politics in a healthy way? I think that there is. And for me, I find inspiration from a passage of scripture in the book, or actually a letter called James. And this is how I guide my life. This is the principle that helps me to have conversations about something that is important and that I do have very strong opinions on. And the reason why it's so helpful is because it brings tremendous clarity to the conversation. Now, if you're here and you wouldn't consider yourself a Christian, maybe you're not a regular church attender, or you don't really take the whole God thing seriously, and you're here because somebody invited you or because they told you that there was other young, hot, single people here, that's great. You don't have to do anything I'm about to say, and this doesn't have to inform the way that you talk about politics. But for those of us who are Christians, I think we have to pay attention to this. So I'm going to look at this short passage. It's a very short passage from the book of James. And let me just tell you really quickly where that comes from. So James is a guy who was actually Jesus's brother, right? This is Jesus' brother. And he handed down a tradition. He realized that the whole Jesus movement had incredible political ramifications within the Roman Empire. And he knew that people were going to talk about this stuff, that the early Christian communities were going to talk about this stuff, and probably chances are they would be divided over these conversations. And so through a series of sermons and stuff, he handed down this tradition to the people who followed him. And one of those people wrote down or collected his writings and his sermons, and they put it into this letter that we now name after James. And so it's kind of like an amalgamation of what James taught right after Jesus' death and resurrection. So here's what he says to a group of Christians whose movement and whose beliefs have now started all these political ramifications. And he says this. He said, "So understand this, my brothers and sisters. You must all be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to get angry. The first thing you've got to do is you've got to be quick to listen. Now, I don't know if you guys have been paying attention, but listening is not normally the first thing that people do. If you switch on the news, if you go to Twitter, people are not generally asking questions and waiting for responses. People are shouting over each other. People are getting heated and they're talking and everybody wants to voice their opinion and they want to be heard, they want to be heard, they want to be heard, but nobody wants to listen. And James, he says, no, listen, the first thing you have got to do, the first port of call is listen, then be slow to speak. Like, actually consider what you're going to say. I know that we all know this because when we were teenagers, we used to just type text messages and hit send. Now we don't do that, or at least we probably don't do that, right? We wait for a second. That's one of the beauties of text messages we've learned. We can wait a second, think about what we want to say, and then reply. And James is saying, yes, that's exactly what you do. When you have a conversation that wants to divide you, when you have a conversation with people who have polar opposite opinions, be slow to speak and be slow to get angry. Here's what's really interesting about this. He doesn't say don't get angry. He doesn't say, and don't ever have an emotional reaction to anything that anyone says. He doesn't say that. He says, be slow to get angry. In other words, there are some things that you probably should be angry about. And I know for us, as we flick through Twitter, or as we watch the news, or as we have conversations, and we hear what's going on, there are some things that make us mad. And I'm gonna be honest, there are some things that should outrage you. When you see people being taken advantage of, when you see injustice being perpetuated and maybe even institutionalized, you should be furious. You should be outraged. You should be angry about that. But you should be slow to get there. If you can bring down the emotional temperature long enough to consider and take an objective approach, it might change the conversation for you. So don't be angry, but be slow, be considered. Don't be that sort of person who just reacts to every little thing that people say. Be slow to get angry. And the thing about this is, this advice, it's not about the knowledge or the wisdom that you bring to a conversation. It's about the posture with which you approach the conversation. This is about postures. So for our last few minutes together, I want to give us 4 postures that I think we can bring to a conversation about politics that will help it be a helpful, healthy, and beneficial conversation. 4 postures that I think if you start bringing these, they can be a launching pad for mutual thriving. They can get you on the same page and help you start moving forward towards your mutual thriving together. So we're going to talk about these 4 postures, and here's what they are: humility, teachability, intentionality, and curiosity. Humility, teachability, intentionality, and curiosity. These are 4 postures that we can bring into conversations. I didn't make these up. I didn't invent them. I didn't even put these 4 things on a list together. I've learned this from people who are far smarter and far better at having hard conversations than me. But here's the thing, humility. Humility is the ability to view ourselves accurately in light of God and in light of others. It's not to think less of ourselves, it's to think of ourselves less. And humility, and a posture of humility, says, I don't know everything. All right, I'm willing to say, I don't know everything. I know that you see things different than me. I know that I don't agree with your opinion, and I think if we do that in this country, it's all just gonna go down the crapper. But listen, I'm smart enough to know I don't know everything. But here's the thing. Sometimes we can get tricked into thinking that that's the end of it. But isn't it true that most of us can admit we don't know everything, right? Like, we know. I don't know every single thing there is to know. But what we don't always admit to is that in this given conversation, I might not be right about this. Because that's the thing. I know I don't know everything, but I'm right about this. That's why we're having the argument, because I think I'm right. But a posture of humility says, I don't know everything, and I maybe could be wrong about this. I could be wrong about this. Even though I have an opinion, even though I've thought about it for a long time, I don't know everything, and I might be wrong about this. If we just ended there and we're like, okay, if we could say this at the beginning of every conversation about politics, of every conversation with somebody who doesn't believe like us, this would change everything. I don't know everything, and I might be wrong about this, and if that was the preamble, that would be amazing. But there's more. Teachability. A posture of teachability says, I am open to seeing things differently. I'm open to seeing things differently. I know that I don't know everything, so I'm willing to be influenced by somebody who might know something that I don't yet know. I'm open to it, and I might start to see things differently. Intentionality. This posture says, I'm pursuing conversation with people with different experiences. I'm actually not just waiting for conversations to come to me, but I'm intentionally going to talk to other people. I'm having the conversations, I'm asking the questions. And not just with people of my kind, not just with people who agree with me, not just with other Republicans, not just with other Democrats, not just with other people who are against this crowd, and we come together and we talk and we have conversations about like, oh, those people annoy me so much. Yeah, they annoy me too. Yeah, oh my goodness. Ah. But people with different experiences, and this word experiences is so important. We're going to talk about more about that in a few minutes. But the last posture, I nearly fell over. The last posture, curiosity, says I genuinely care about people's stories. I genuinely care. I'm curious. I want to know your story. I know that I don't know it all, so I want to hear your story. I want to hear what your experience has been. And there's a couple of things that build on this that I want you to know. The first thing is, we have got to resist narratives and embrace stories. Resist narratives and embrace stories. The narratives, we hear them all the time. The left has a narrative, the right has a narrative, the center has a narrative, everyone has a narrative, the media has a narrative, everyone has a narrative. We all have narratives. Narratives are the myths we create to justify our opinions. Narratives are the myths we create to justify our opinions. In a narrative, we look at the whole story, but then we attach motives to people's behavior. We attach meaning to events that suit our opinion and our agenda, and it explains why I believe what I believe. That's what a narrative is. And I know it's hard to resist narratives because sometimes they agree with us, and where the narrative agrees with us, we want to embrace it. But I want us as much as possible to be the sort of people who resist those narratives. Don't get drawn in to this, but embrace stories. Who are willing to listen to what other people have to say. And with that in mind, we want to be people with stories in mind who prioritize experience over opinions. We all have opinions. Every one of us has an opinion. But we also have experiences. And our opinions aren't always based on fact. And if we're really honest, we know this. Because your opinion has changed. Your opinion on something has changed. Probably your opinion that you had last year on this person, or last year on this issue, or 10 years ago, or 15 years ago, it's probably changed because it wasn't fully based on objective facts. And people can disprove our opinions, but you can't disprove an experience. An experience is just what it is. It's somebody's lived experience. It's what somebody has been through. And we want to, if we can be the sort of people who prioritize experience over opinions, then we can get somewhere. We could even learn something. We're not just interested in going, hey, what do you think about this? But hey, not just what is your opinion, but what has your experience been? Let me say something about this. And this is not going to be brand new news to anybody, but here's a perfect example of this. When it comes to racial justice, if you're a white person, your opinion on racial injustice does not carry as much weight as the experience of a person of color. It just doesn't. That's not revolutionary. Lived experience carries more weight than the opinions that we intellectually form. And if we can prioritize experience over opinions, we might move together towards mutual thriving. And we might even be able to say what I think is like, this sums up what James was talking about. Like, I think if James heard us say this statement, he'd go, yes, Yes, that's it. That's where I want you guys to get in your conversations. But we might say this: if I had experienced what you experienced, I might see it the way you see it. If I had experienced what you experienced, I might see it the way you see it. Look, we do not currently believe the same thing, but I didn't go through your experience. I didn't grow up where you grew up. I didn't experience the injustice that you have experienced. I didn't experience the privilege that you experienced. But if I did, I might see it the way that you see it. That is a posture of humility. That is a conversation that can bring healing to relationships rather than division. And I think if we can approach conversations this way, then this conversation can move to a conversation of polarization to a conversation full of nuance. Because polarized conversations draw a line in the sand, and one person is over here and the other's over there. But that's not reality. If we're honest, we don't work. We're not fully this or that. We're a little bit of maybe both, or maybe even more. We see things from a nuanced perspective. There's subtlety in things. That's what nuance means. It means being able to see the subtleties in a belief or an experience. We want to be people who embrace nuance in our conversations. You see, it's not that simple. You can support police and support Black Lives Matter. You can support this and that. You can be Republican and a good person and care about healthcare. You can be a Democrat and still love others well and care about fiscal responsibility. None of us are black and white, simple categories. We are nuanced people, and our conversations should be nuanced. And when we approach it in that way, when we approach it from the right posture, we carry nuance into it. Here's the last thing. For those of us who call ourselves Christians, we're called to this. If you're not a Jesus follower, you don't have to conduct your conversations this way at all. You can just go, that was a load of rubbish. Or you can go, you know what, that sounds helpful, and you can try it on for size and see how it goes. I think if you do, it'll make your conversations better. I think it'll make your relationships better. I think you might learn something. I think you might be able to teach somebody something, perhaps, if you conduct your conversations that way. But you don't have to. No requirement. But if you're a Christian who wants to live your life the way that Jesus modeled living, it is impossible. It is impossible to live like Jesus did and not put others first. That's it. That's what Jesus calls us to. That's what he requires in living the way that he asks us to live. Others first. Not me first, not my community first, not my belief system first, not the people who agree with me first, not the people who are from where I'm from first, others first. I am going to put other people and their needs and their concerns before my own. And if we can all do that, if we could all be committed to putting each other first, if we could all be committed to hearing each other's stories, even when we don't agree, listening to each other's perspectives, even when it differs from ours, and we put each other first, I feel like we can organize ourselves to thrive together. I think we can have good conversations, but it requires approaching the conversation with humility and teachability and intentionality and in curiosity. And instead of having conversations where it's us versus them, we would have conversations where it's us versus us. We're seeing each other's perspectives and we're putting each other first. If we could put love before judgment, like we sang about tonight, if we could be the sort of people who love to show mercy rather than judge people, that could change everything. A couple of people on our nights team heard this song during the week, and it talks about this idea of loving people, putting others first, and love being the one thing that we can offer to those around us. And so we're gonna have Will come and he's gonna sing that song. And I know for some of us, this might be a new idea. Maybe some of this stuff is like, yeah, that sounds good, but it sounds really hard. I would agree with that. Maybe for some of you, this seems like, I don't know if I agree with all that. I don't know if I can get on board. And if that's the case, I just want to give you a few minutes to digest this. or maybe even process how you can go about doing that in your life.